images caught the imagination of the entire world. The triumph of the Sandinista Revolution on July 19, 1979 was celebrated with euphoria in Nicaragua and applauded far and wide. It marked the end of one of the region's most corrupt and brutal dictatorships and the beginning of a promise of freedom and democracy in an impoverished and war-torn country.
It was the culmination of a long struggle, a victory for our country's independence, sovereignty and self-determination.
But in Washington, the victory of the young pro-Cuban Sandinistas was seen as a threat, one the United States would go to extraordinary lengths to crush.
To do nothing in Central America is to give the first communist stronghold on the North American continent a green light to spread its poison throughout this free and increasingly democratic hemisphere.
30 years on, and the revolution is just a distant memory. Nicaragua is once again ruled by the Sandinistas, and Daniel Ortega is once again the president. But this version of the Sandinistas is one that many of the original revolutionaries would not recognize. I covered the Sandinista revolution. Now, 3 decades on, I've returned to see how that revolution changed Nicaragua. American interests in Nicaragua go far back, long before the 1980s Reagan era. Since the 1800s, the United States had been calling the shots, invading Nicaragua no less than 8 times, overthrowing and installing successive governments. And their interests extended to their control of land and agricultural production, meaning that the rural poor were essentially tenants on their own land. But this overwhelming U.S. influence helped create a Nicaraguan rebel legend. Augusto Cesar Sandino would lead the first armed nationalist movement in Latin America to drive American military forces from the region. Sandino's name would later be taken by the Sandinistas, who claimed to be representing his principles.
I identify myself with Sandino because the thinking on Sandino was very simple for me. It was based in 3 bases. Sovereignty, independence of Nicaraguan sovereignty, democracy and social progress, social justice.
Sandino's image is still everywhere. It stands as a symbol of Nicaragua's struggle for freedom from abuse of power and from foreign domination. Yet he was to meet his end at the hands of the American-backed Anastasio Somoza Garcia, the first leader of a family dictatorship that was to endure for 43 years. U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said of him, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch."
Nicaragua is a beautiful town.
He used his power to accumulate enormous personal wealth at the expense of the peasantry, a family business that was continued by the 2 sons. But it was his second son, General Anastasio Somoza Debayle, whose regime became infamous for its intolerance of dissent. As the Sandinista rebellion grew, so too did the violent response. The Masaya volcano, some 20 kilometers south of the capital, Managua, has a particularly gruesome past. During the Somoza dictatorship, the National Guard would sometimes throw political opponents into the mouth of this volcano. Such was the brutality of the regime that the resistance movement soon gained widespread support, not just at home, but also abroad. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN, was a broad-based coalition of students, intellectuals, and farm workers, led by a committee of 9 military commanders, or comandantes. Among them was Daniel Ortega, who would eventually become the first amongst equals. But the face that the world would first come to know was that of Eden Pastora, a bold and charismatic rebel commander with a knack for having his picture taken.
Do you want me to show you a photo that's never been published? That's Daniel and me when we went to Cuba in 1976 to sell Fidel our project.
76, 77.
Oh my God. That project would gain worldwide attention 2 years later when Pastora led a spectacular assault on the National Palace. Nearly 1,000 hostages were taken. He obtained in exchange the release of 59 political prisoners and safe passage to Panama for those involved in the attack. As Pastora climbed the stairs of the plane, he, unlike the rest of his comrades, removed his mask. A calculated move to make his the face of the Sandinista attack. To this day, he has no regrets.
We had no other choice but to take up arms. The politicians had exhausted all other civic options. My father was assassinated by the Somozas when I was 8 years old, and so I grew up seeking justice, until I finally took a rifle in my hand and implemented justice on my own.
With support of sympathetic governments from Cuba to neighboring Costa Rica, the Sandinista rebellion grew, pitting the Somoza regime against the people. But Somoza remained defiant, insisting that he, not the Sandinistas, had their support.
They're not becoming stronger. If they were becoming stronger, we would have public demonstrations here. If they had the support of the people, I wouldn't be here.
By January 1979, the rebellion had developed into an all-out conflict. Over the next 7 months, more than 30,000 people would die. Washington was mistrustful of the Sandinistas and was reluctant to withdraw support for Somoza. But it looked on with increasing unease at Somoza's blatant disregard for human rights.
From the time in which the elder Somoza took power to the moment in which the younger Somoza, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, was overthrown by the Sandinistas in July of 1979. During that period of time, U.S. policy to Nicaragua was complex. By and large, the U.S. supported Somoza, but there were many moments in which the United States was opposed to his regime and tried to encourage him to either step aside or permit free elections, but to no avail.
In June 1979, these images of American television correspondent Bill Stewart being executed by the National Guard reached American living rooms. With these images, any lingering U.S. support for the Somoza regime came to an end. Deprived of American support, Somoza and many of his senior officers fled the country. On July 19, 1979, the nation celebrated the Sandinista Revolution. Mónica Baltodano was one of the resistance top military commanders in Managua.
Our dream was not just to remove Somoza as a dictator, but also to initiate a new phase that would resolve the extreme poverty in our country. We wanted access to education, to land, and to material benefits from which the majority of Nicaraguans were and continue to be excluded.
A government of national reconstruction was formed, with moderates from the business community, intellectuals, conservative political parties, and Marxists. It was an unprecedented revolutionary experiment in the region. The Sandinistas promised political pluralism, a mixed economy, and non-alignment. But within months, these high ideals would be put to the test. as old tensions with the U.S. re-emerged.